Have you ever wondered whether your ancestors actually slept through the entire night without waking once? Or have we simply forgotten a rhythm that shaped human life for countless generations? In medieval Europe, darkness held a quiet secret that most of us would mistake for a sleeping disorder today. Yet for the people who lived beneath those endless nights, it was as ordinary as sunrise itself. Before we settle into this journey together, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if stories like this help you unwind. Then pull your blanket a little closer, breathe slowly, and let yourself drift into a village where the night unfolds very differently from the one you know. Picture yourself in the 15th century, resting on a straw mattress inside a modest house built from timber and packed earth, while heavy cloth and rough wooden shutters keep the cold night outside. The sun disappeared hours ago. There are no glowing windows, no street lamps, and no silent screens filling the darkness with blue light, leaving only the fading memory of a tallow candle or the last embers resting quietly inside the hearth. Wrapped beneath thick wool blankets, you surrendered to sleep soon after sunset because the movement of the sky governed every part of daily life. But what if the sleep you believed was complete had only just begun? This quiet pattern belonged to farmers, craftsmen, monks, nobles, and families across countless villages for centuries, although none of them would have described it as unusual because they knew no other way to rest. What we call a full, uninterrupted night's sleep would have seemed unfamiliar to them, since the normal rhythm divided the night into a first sleep, a peaceful waking interval, and then a second sleep before dawn returned. Today, that forgotten custom may sound surprising, yet it was once so deeply woven into ordinary life that almost nobody felt the need to explain it. For generations, this remarkable habit remained hidden in plain sight until a historian named Roger Kirch began patiently examining forgotten diaries, legal records, private letters, literary works, and medieval medical writings, where the same curious expressions appeared again and again. People repeatedly referred to a first sleep, a second sleep, and the quiet period between them simply as the waking time, not as an illness or inconvenience, but as an expected part of every ordinary night. If so many voices from different centuries described exactly the same pattern, could this forgotten rhythm reveal something about the way our own bodies were originally meant to rest? The answer begins with the world they inhabited, because the medieval night was far longer than the one most of us experience today, especially through the cold months when darkness arrived before supper and lingered well into the morning. During winter, many communities spent close to 14 hours beneath an unbroken sky without artificial light, making it surprisingly difficult for the human body to remain asleep from dusk until dawn in one continuous stretch. Modern life has shortened the night with electricity, but what happens when those distractions disappear and the body is left to follow only the rising and setting of the sun? Researchers have recreated those ancient conditions by asking volunteers to live for weeks without electric lighting, relying only on daylight and faint evening illumination, and the results have been remarkably familiar. After their bodies adjusted, most participants naturally settled into roughly 4 hours of sleep, awakened peacefully for a quiet interval, and then drifted into another 4 hours before morning arrived. During that calm period between the two sleeps, the mind entered an unusually tranquil state that felt neither fully awake nor completely asleep, echoing descriptions written centuries ago by people who never imagined their nightly routine would one day become a historical mystery. Now imagine yourself opening your eyes in complete darkness, not because something startled you awake, but because your body quietly decided that the first part of the night had reached its natural end. You have no clock beside your bed, although somewhere in the distance the faint sound of a church bell may have marked another passing hour, leaving only the warmth of your blankets, the slow breathing of those sleeping beside you, and the stillness that fills every corner of the room. Instead of worrying about why you are awake, you simply accept the moment, because everyone around you understands that this peaceful pause belongs to the night just as much as sleep itself. The mattress beneath you shifts softly as you move, and you become aware of the familiar texture of coarse linen, the comforting weight of wool, and the quiet presence of your family sharing the same sleeping space. Medieval homes rarely offered separate bedrooms, so husbands, wives, children, and sometimes even honored guests rested side by side, making the silence feel less lonely and more like a shared ritual that unfolded every night without question. Could the simple comfort of knowing others were awake somewhere nearby have made these midnight hours feel far less frightening than they often seem today? Some people whispered about the day that had passed or spoke gently about tomorrow's work, while others remained silent, letting their thoughts wander without urgency through memories, hopes, and quiet reflection. Prayer was especially common during this interval, and many devotional books contain specific prayers intended to be recited after the first sleep, suggesting that this waking period was seen not as an interruption, but as an ideal moment for contemplation before returning to bed. Rather than fighting wakefulness, they welcomed it as another peaceful chapter of the night, trusting that the second sleep would arrive naturally when both body and mind were ready. Others quietly slipped out of bed to relieve themselves in a chamber pot, took a sip of water or weak ale kept within easy reach, or stirred the dying embers in the hearth before adding another small piece of firewood to preserve a little warmth for the hours ahead. None of these simple acts were treated as unusual interruptions because they belonged to the natural rhythm of the night, and surviving records describe them with the same ordinary tone people might use today when mentioning breakfast or sunset. If waking in the middle of the night felt so completely normal, why do so many of us now believe that every interruption to sleep must be a problem? The surviving evidence paints an unexpectedly vivid picture of these midnight hours, revealing medical texts that recommended the period after the first sleep as the ideal time for married couples to conceive, because the body had already rested and digestion had settled. Personal journals describe craftsmen stepping briefly into nearby workshops to inspect a drying project, while farmers sometimes visited their stables to make certain their animals remained calm before returning to bed without haste. These accounts were never written to impress future historians, which is precisely why they offer such a convincing glimpse into everyday medieval life. Nearly all of this happened in almost complete darkness because every candle represented an expense, and few families were willing to waste precious tallow unless it was truly necessary. People knew every beam, doorway, and corner of their homes so well that they could move confidently by touch, guided by memory instead of sight, while listening to the gentle creak of timber, the breathing of those around them, and the distant whisper of the wind outside. In a world where darkness was familiar rather than foreign, the night awakened senses that modern life rarely asks us to use. That does not mean medieval people believed the night was free from danger, because they certainly associated darkness with uncertainty and warned against wandering through lonely streets without good reason. Yet inside the home, surrounded by family and familiar sounds, the waking interval was usually experienced as a peaceful space rather than a frightening one, allowing quiet conversations, private prayers, and moments of affection to unfold naturally before the second sleep returned. Could it be that fear of the night grew stronger only after we lost the comforting rhythm that once made these silent hours feel perfectly ordinary? The idea that waking during the night signaled a sleep disorder simply did not exist in this world, because no one expected rest to unfold as one long, uninterrupted stretch until sunrise. There were no glowing clocks reminding you how late it was, no anxious thoughts about needing exactly 8 continuous hours, and no pressure to force yourself back to sleep before your mind was ready. Instead, people trusted that after a quiet interval the body would gently invite them into the second sleep without effort, just as it always had. When the first pale light finally slipped through the narrow cracks of the shutters and the rooster announced the coming day, the night's cycle quietly reached its conclusion. Yet what makes this forgotten habit so remarkable is that something practiced by millions across countless generations almost disappeared from memory, leaving behind only scattered references hidden inside ordinary documents rather than grand philosophical works. How could such a universal part of human life vanish so completely that even historians overlooked it for centuries? The answer lay in the very ordinariness of the custom, because people rarely explain what everyone around them already understands. It took Roger Akerch carefully reading a 17th-century English court record, where a witness casually mentioned that an event happened after the first sleep, before he realized those familiar words pointed toward an entirely forgotten pattern hidden across historical sources. That single observation encouraged him to search much more deeply, and what he uncovered would transform the modern understanding of sleep. As his research expanded, the same expressions appeared hundreds of times across texts written in English, French, Italian, and Latin, proving that this was no isolated tradition confined to one village or one century. Geoffrey Chaucer referred to the first sleep in the Canterbury Tales. Cervantes described Sancho Panza resting after his first sleep in Don Quixote, and even echoes of the same habit appear in ancient literature, suggesting that the practice reached far beyond medieval Europe. The more evidence emerged, the clearer it became that this forgotten rhythm belonged not to a single culture, but to a much older human experience that stretched across generations and, perhaps, across civilizations themselves. Anthropologists later discovered remarkably similar sleeping patterns among traditional communities living without electricity in parts of Africa and South America, reinforcing the idea that human biology had changed far less than the world surrounding it. The transformation came instead through artificial lighting, expanding cities, caffeinated drinks, industrial schedules, and the growing expectation that every productive hour should be tightly controlled. If the night itself was reshaped by civilization, is it possible that our understanding of what counts as normal sleep changed with it rather than with our own bodies? The old rhythm did not disappear overnight, but faded slowly as evening itself began to change, first with oil lamps illuminating busy streets, then with gaslights stretching activity long after sunset, and finally with electric bulbs turning darkness into little more than another working hour. Coffee and tea became increasingly common, stimulating minds that once would have settled naturally into rest, while factories demanded fixed schedules that left little room for a sleep pattern divided into two peaceful halves. Before long, sleeping in separate segments came to be viewed not as ordinary human behavior, but as an outdated habit that belonged to another age. By the 19th century, medical advice increasingly encouraged people to remain asleep through the entire night, and the arrival of widespread electric lighting strengthened that expectation until it became the accepted standard across much of society. Anyone who regularly woke after midnight was now more likely to be described as suffering from insomnia than following a rhythm that had guided generations before them, even though the body itself may not have changed nearly as much as the world surrounding it. Could it be that what we often call a sleep problem is sometimes the quiet echo of an ancient pattern that modern life has taught us to ignore? Now return once more to your medieval home, where your eyes have been open for several peaceful minutes, and the silence around you feels almost alive instead of empty. You remember your grandmother saying that this part of the night was a gentle gift, a brief passage between one sleep and the next when the mind became especially clear, and as you sit upright the straw beneath you rustles softly, while someone beside you shifts without fully waking. The room remains cold, yet there is no hurry to move because this interval belongs to no obligation except simply existing within the calm of the night. You lower your feet onto the packed earth floor and instinctively count the familiar steps toward the hearth, your fingertips brushing the rough surface of the wall as easily as though they could see in the dark. Kneeling beside the ashes, you carefully search for a surviving ember hidden beneath the gray layer until a tiny red glow answers your patience. And after a few slow breaths, a fragile flame begins to grow just enough to awaken the tip of a waiting candle. The small light barely reaches across the room, yet it transforms the darkness into dancing shadows that make the humble house seem quietly alive once again. Across the room, your wife opens her eyes and watches you without surprise, offering only a gentle smile, because this scene has unfolded countless nights before. Soon the two of you will quietly speak about repairing the roof before the autumn rains arrive, or deciding whether another field should be planted in oats. And afterward she will return to her second sleep, while you remain beside the fading fire for a few peaceful moments longer. Nothing about the conversation feels urgent, yet perhaps that is exactly why these forgotten hours became one of the calmest parts of medieval life. You let the candle burn only for a moment before allowing it to fade again, because even a small flame carries a cost, and your eyes have long since learned to trust the darkness instead. Your elderly neighbor, who lives alone a few houses away, often spends this same quiet interval passing his fingers over a simple wooden rosary while whispering prayers that only he and God can hear. insisting that the world feels closest to heaven when nearly everyone else is asleep. Even if you are less devoted than he is, you cannot deny that the silence surrounding the village seems to invite thoughts that never appear during the noise of daylight. As you stand there listening, memories begin to surface without effort, carrying you back to nights when you were a child lying beneath the same roof while your parents whispered softly after their first sleep. You never understood the words they exchanged, yet the gentle rhythm of their voices always made the darkness feel safe. And now, without realizing it, your own children are growing up with the same comforting sounds surrounding them. Could this forgotten interval have survived for centuries not only because of biology, but because it quietly strengthened the invisible bonds holding families together? Curiosity draws you toward the narrow window, where you lift the heavy cloth covering the opening and peer into a night so dark that the sky seems almost endless. No moon shines above the village, and even the stars have hidden themselves behind thick clouds. Yet somewhere beyond the rooftops, the deep voice of the church bell slowly rolls across the sleeping countryside before dissolving back into silence. You cannot measure the hour with certainty, but your body senses that the waking interval is beginning to pass and that the second sleep is patiently waiting just beyond the edge of awareness. A faint barking dog answers another somewhere across the village, followed by the heavy footsteps of someone walking steadily along the dirt road outside your home. There is no alarm in the sound because you recognize the familiar pace of the night watchman making his rounds with a dim lantern and a sturdy staff, repeating the same route every evening so faithfully that his presence has become another part of the night's quiet rhythm. Knowing that someone remains awake while the rest of the village drifts peacefully between two sleeps gives the darkness an unexpected feeling of order rather than uncertainty. You close the window once more, replace the cloth against the cold, and find your way back to the bed without needing even the smallest light to guide you. Your wife gently turns toward you, resting her arm across your chest while both of you remain awake for another peaceful moment, listening to the last crackle from the hearth as your thoughts slowly begin to dissolve into silence. One by one, the worries of fields, weather, and tomorrow's work drift away until the warmth beneath the blankets quietly draws you into the second sleep, leaving the medieval night to continue its hidden story beyond your door. Outside your home, the watchman pauses before your door and slowly raises the small horn lantern hanging from his hand, its pale yellow glow spreading only a few steps across the uneven ground before surrendering once more to the darkness. The lantern is made not from glass, but from carefully scraped horn, a practical material that softens the light into a warm haze while protecting the small tallow candle burning inside, with its faint, familiar scent. Beyond that tiny circle of light, the village disappears into shadow, reminding anyone awake that night has boundaries no flame can fully erase. In his left hand, he carries the lantern, while his right rests comfortably around the smooth handle of a heavy oak staff, used less for fighting than for announcing his presence with a reassuring knock against the road whenever needed. A small iron rattle hangs from his belt as well, ready to sound an alarm should danger ever appear, although on most nights it remains silent as another ordinary tool of a peaceful routine. The man's name is Gervis, and for the past 12 years he has served as the village's eyes and ears while nearly everyone else passes quietly between their first and second sleep. Long before becoming the night watchman, Gervis earned his living working the fields until an injury to his foot made heavy farm labor impossible, encouraging the villagers to entrust him with a different responsibility instead. Now he knows every household along these narrow lanes, recognizing which families tend to wake briefly during the night and which windows occasionally reveal the soft glow of a single candle before darkness returns. Could there be a better guardian than someone who understands not only the streets themselves, but also the peaceful rhythms of the people sleeping behind every wooden door? He lowers the lantern toward your doorstep and quietly studies the entrance, satisfied that the heavy door remains firmly closed and securely barred from the inside. He has often noticed the faint light escaping through your shutters during the waking interval, but he never mistakes it for trouble because he knows your household follows the same forgotten rhythm shared by so many others in the village. What might seem suspicious to a stranger simply tells him that another family is peacefully living through the quiet pause separating one sleep from the next. To Gervis, there is nothing remarkable about people waking after several hours of rest, because his own nights follow exactly the same pattern. Before beginning his rounds, he shared a simple evening meal with his wife, slept for several hours after sunset, and awakened naturally without any need for bells or voices before quietly dressing in thick wool and worn leather boots. For him, the watch begins only after his own first sleep has ended, making his profession part of the same nightly rhythm that guides everyone else around him. Gervis moves at an unhurried pace, allowing every sound to reach him before taking another step along the winding lane. The faint rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft shifting of livestock inside nearby barns tell him far more than hurried footsteps ever could. For years of walking these same paths have taught him that the quietest nights reveal the most. When every familiar sound remains in its proper place, he knows the village is resting exactly as it should. As he reaches the edge of the settlement, the houses gradually give way to fenced gardens and open fields where darkness seems even deeper beneath the wide sky. The lantern's gentle glow barely reaches the nearest fence posts, yet Gervis no longer depends on its light, because every bend in the road, every ancient oak, and every weathered stone has become part of a landscape committed to memory. How many nights would it take before the darkness itself began to feel as familiar as daylight? Not far away, another family has also awakened during the peaceful interval between their two sleeps, though their small cottage remains almost completely hidden from view. Inside, an elderly woman quietly feeds another piece of wood into the hearth while her daughter mends a torn sleeve by the weak glow of the fire, neither of them speaking above a whisper because there is no need to disturb those still sleeping nearby. These simple moments rarely found their way into history books, yet they form the fabric of ordinary medieval life far more than battles or royal ceremonies ever could. Across countless villages, similar scenes unfolded night after night without anyone believing they were participating in a remarkable tradition. One household offered quiet prayers, another prepared bread dough to rise before dawn, while somewhere else an old man simply sat listening to the wind outside until sleep gently returned, each family following a rhythm they assumed had always existed and always would. It is often the most ordinary habits that disappear most completely, precisely because no one thinks they need to be remembered. Before continuing his rounds, Gervis lifts his eyes toward the dark outline of the parish church standing above the clustered rooftops. Its tower remains invisible except for the faint suggestion of its shape against the cloudy sky. Yet he knows that within those thick stone walls monks in larger monasteries and some members of the clergy elsewhere may already be rising for nighttime prayers, following another ancient rhythm that divided the hours of darkness with remarkable devotion. Could the same night that invited villagers back into quiet sleep also call others to remain awake in solemn worship, each believing they were honoring the natural order of the world? In many monasteries, the night was not a stretch of uninterrupted sleep, but a carefully ordered passage divided by prayer, reflection, and rest. Bells echoed through silent cloisters, calling monks from their beds to gather beneath vaulted ceilings where candlelight flickered across worn stone as ancient psalms rose softly into the darkness before they returned once again to their second sleep. While their routine was shaped by religious devotion rather than village custom, it reflected the same understanding that the hours between dusk and dawn were never meant to pass as one unbroken period of unconsciousness. Beyond the monastery walls, however, the village remained wrapped in an altogether different silence, one filled not with chanting, but with the small sounds of ordinary lives unfolding almost unnoticed. A baby stirred briefly before settling again. An old dog lifted its head at the passing watchman and drifted back to sleep, while somewhere a shutter creaked gently in the breeze before everything became still once more. It is remarkable how history often preserves the voices of kings and battles, yet allows these quiet moments, repeated by countless ordinary people, to fade almost completely from memory. Gervis continues along the narrow lane until he reaches the small bridge crossing a slow-moving stream at the edge of the village. He pauses there out of habit, raising the lantern just high enough to examine the path for fresh footprints or broken branches that might suggest someone had passed recently, though tonight the damp earth tells no unusual story. The bridge has stood here longer than anyone can remember, And on peaceful nights like this, it serves less as a place of concern than as a quiet reminder that every road leading into the village also leads back out into the unknown. The air has grown colder since midnight, and a thin layer of mist begins forming above the fields where tomorrow's crops wait silently beneath the darkness. Gervis draws his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders, not with discomfort, but with the calm familiarity of a man who has walked through hundreds of such nights, each one carrying its own subtle changes in wind, scent, and temperature. Could someone who spent every night beneath the open sky learn to read its smallest changes as easily as another person reads the pages of a book? Far behind him, within the warmth of your home, your breathing has already slowed once more as the second sleep quietly settles over you without effort or resistance. There is no struggle to force sleep to return because nothing during the waking interval suggested that anything had gone wrong, and your body simply follows a rhythm that generations before you accepted without question. While the watchman continues beneath the stars and the monastery bells prepare for another distant prayer, the village itself drifts together into the final peaceful hours before dawn. The first pale hint of morning still lies well beyond the horizon. Yet the village has already begun its quiet return to rest, as though an unseen signal has passed gently from house to house. Fires settle into glowing embers, whispered conversations come to a natural end, and those who remained awake during the peaceful interval once again pull their wool blankets close, allowing the second sleep to arrive without invitation. If you had wandered through these narrow lanes at this moment, would you have realized that nearly every family had already lived through an entire chapter of the night, while the world around them remained almost perfectly silent? For medieval physicians, this pattern required no explanation because it simply reflected the natural balance between the body and the changing seasons. Medical writings influenced by ancient traditions often advised patients about the hours between the first and second sleep, discussing them with the same confidence used when describing meals, exercise, or the proper time for work, revealing that segmented sleep belonged to everyday life rather than unusual circumstances. The absence of concern in these texts may be one of the strongest clues that this rhythm was accepted so completely that few people imagined it could ever disappear. The Church also recognized the unique character of these quiet hours, encouraging private devotion when the mind was calm and free from the demands of daylight. Many prayer books included short reflections intended specifically for those awake after the first sleep, suggesting that believers viewed this interval as an opportunity to strengthen their faith before returning peacefully to bed. Rather than resisting wakefulness, they transformed it into a moment of gratitude, allowing silence itself to become part of their spiritual life. Not everyone spent those minutes in prayer, of course, because medieval villages were filled with ordinary people whose concerns remained wonderfully practical. A baker might quietly inspect dough prepared before sunset, judging by touch whether it would be ready for the ovens at dawn, while a shepherd listened carefully for any unusual movement from the animals resting inside nearby pens before returning home. These brief tasks required only a few moments, yet they fit naturally into a night already divided by custom rather than by obligation. The remarkable truth is that no one believed they were following a remarkable tradition at all. Children grew into adults watching their parents wake peacefully after several hours of sleep, and later repeated exactly the same rhythm with families of their own, passing the habit from one generation to the next without ever needing to explain why. Sometimes the most enduring customs leave the fewest written instructions because everyone assumes they will always remain exactly as they are. As the centuries passed, however, the world surrounding this ancient rhythm slowly began to change in ways few people could have imagined. New sources of light extended the evening far beyond sunset. Merchants kept their shops open later. Households remained active well into the night, and the long stretches of darkness that had quietly shaped human sleep for generations gradually became shorter with every passing decade. Without anyone making a conscious decision, daily life was beginning to rewrite one of humanity's oldest habits. Artificial light did more than brighten homes and streets. It gently altered the signals that had guided the human body since long before written history. Instead of growing sleepy soon after dusk, people stayed awake reading, working, talking, and eventually enjoying forms of entertainment that would have been impossible in a medieval village where every candle carried a price. Could such a simple invention have changed not only the appearance of the night, but also the rhythm hidden deep within the human mind? The Industrial Revolution accelerated this transformation even further by replacing seasonal routines with strict schedules measured by clocks instead of sunlight. Factory whistles demanded that thousands of workers rise at the same hour regardless of the season, leaving little room for a peaceful waking interval between two natural periods of sleep, and society slowly came to value uninterrupted rest because efficiency required predictable mornings. What had once been perfectly ordinary gradually became unfamiliar, until later generations forgot that another way of sleeping had ever existed. By the beginning of the 20th century, the expectation of sleeping continuously through the night had become so widespread that waking after several hours was increasingly viewed as something that needed correction. Physicians, influenced by changing lifestyles and modern schedules, began describing uninterrupted sleep as the ideal standard, while countless people who naturally awakened during the night started believing that something must be wrong with them. Yet the historical record quietly preserved a different story, reminding us that for much of human history this gentle pause was not a failure of sleep, but one of its most familiar features. Today, researchers continue exploring the relationship between natural light, circadian rhythms, and the way our ancestors rested, discovering evidence that often echoes descriptions written hundreds of years ago. Although modern life cannot simply return to the world of medieval villages, these studies encourage us to look at our own sleep with greater curiosity rather than immediate concern, asking whether some experiences we consider unusual may actually have remarkably deep historical roots. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not that our ancestors slept differently, but that humanity forgot such a universal part of everyday life so completely. Even without realizing it, you still carry traces of that forgotten inheritance. Many people occasionally wake in the middle of the night, glance anxiously at the clock, and immediately assume they have failed to achieve the perfect night's sleep. Yet centuries ago, the very same moment would have been greeted with calm acceptance rather than concern. How differently might those quiet hours feel if you believed they were once an ordinary chapter in the human story instead of an unexpected interruption? Imagine yourself once again beneath the heavy wool blankets of your small medieval home as the second sleep slowly gives way to the first faint glow of dawn. Before your eyes even open completely, you hear familiar sounds returning one after another. A rooster greeting the morning, distant cattle stirring inside their shelters, and the soft scrape of someone opening a wooden door somewhere beyond your window. The village is awakening not with sudden urgency, but with the slow confidence of people whose days have always begun in harmony with the rising sun. You sit upright, feeling surprisingly rested after a night divided into two peaceful stretches rather than one uninterrupted block of sleep. The fire has almost faded to gray ash. The air still carries the cool breath of the night, and tiny shafts of pale light now slip through the narrow gaps in the shutters, quietly revealing the outlines of the room that darkness had hidden for so many hours. Nothing about the morning feels hurried because every task will unfold according to rhythms that have guided your family for generations. Outside, neighbors begin greeting one another with familiar smiles as they step onto the muddy lanes carrying buckets, tools, or baskets prepared the evening before. No one speaks about waking during the night because there is nothing unusual to discuss. It happened in nearly every household, just as naturally as sharing the first meal after sunrise or returning home before darkness settled once again. The customs that shape everyday life are often the ones least likely to be mentioned, simply because everyone assumes they are permanent. Children run between cottages while older villagers exchange quiet conversations about the weather, the harvest, and the work awaiting them before the sun climbs too high into the sky. None of them realize that countless generations in the future people will study scattered documents, puzzled by casual references to the first and second sleep, wondering whether those forgotten expressions described something real or merely reflected unusual habits. Ironically, the answers survived not in dramatic chronicles or royal decrees, but in the ordinary words of people who never imagined anyone would one day need those simple details explained. As evening approaches once more, the cycle quietly prepares to begin again without anyone stopping to think about it. Supper is eaten while the last golden light fades beyond the fields. Families gather briefly around the hearth, exchanging the final words of the day. And before long, the village slowly surrenders itself to darkness, because there is little reason to remain awake after sunset. The rhythm that has guided generations is not enforced by laws or written rules, but by the simple partnership between human life and the natural world. For those living in the Middle Ages, darkness was not an empty space waiting to be filled with light, but a living part of each day that carried its own purpose and routines. It invited rest, quiet reflection, and patience instead of constant activity, allowing the hours of the night to unfold gently rather than rushing toward morning. Could our ancestors have understood something about stillness that modern life has almost completely forgotten? Even the architecture of their homes reflected this slower rhythm. Small windows reduced the loss of precious warmth during winter. Thick wooden shutters sealed out the wind after sunset, and the central hearth remained both the physical and emotional heart of the household, gathering the family together before the first sleep quietly arrived. Every feature of the home encouraged people to follow the changing light outside instead of resisting it. When winter settled across the countryside, this connection became even more noticeable as darkness stretched across nearly half the day. Families naturally spent longer periods indoors, sleeping soon after dusk, and allowing the extended night to unfold through its familiar sequence of first sleep, peaceful wakefulness, and second sleep before dawn finally returned. Rather than forcing themselves to remain awake long after sunset, they accepted the season as another chapter in the yearly rhythm of life. Summer brought a different pace, with shorter nights leaving less time between sunset and sunrise, yet the underlying pattern often remained surprisingly familiar. Daily labor in the fields became longer, evening conversations continued beneath the lingering twilight, and sleep adjusted naturally to the changing season without losing the quiet balance that had shaped medieval nights for centuries. The body adapted with remarkable flexibility because it answered first to daylight rather than to fixed numbers on a clock. Autumn and spring occupied the gentle space between these extremes, reminding every household that sleep, like farming, changed gradually with the seasons rather than according to rigid rules. The length of the night expanded and contracted almost unnoticed, and families adjusted without measuring the hours because sunrise and sunset remained the only clocks that truly mattered. Nature itself determined the rhythm, leaving little need for the precise schedules that shape so much of modern life. This close relationship with daylight also influenced the way medieval people thought about health. Physicians frequently encouraged moderation in eating, working, and resting, believing that harmony with the natural order supported both body and mind, and within that understanding the quiet interval between the first and second sleep required no special explanation. Instead of viewing every waking moment as a problem to solve, they often accepted it as one more expression of the body's ordinary balance. Today, scientists studying circadian rhythms have reached conclusions that seem surprisingly familiar beside these historical accounts. Experiments conducted under conditions without artificial lighting repeatedly show that the human body can settle into patterns remarkably similar to those described in centuries-old documents, suggesting that the forgotten rhythm may never have disappeared completely beneath the surface. Could it be that our biology still remembers a way of resting that our daily routines have almost entirely concealed? Of course, not every medieval person experienced the night in exactly the same way, just as no two people sleep identically today. Age, health, occupation, the changing seasons, and the demands of family life all influence the exact length of each sleep and the quiet interval between them. Yet the historical evidence consistently points toward the same broad pattern appearing across different regions and social classes. The details varied from one household to another, but the underlying rhythm remained remarkably recognizable. Perhaps that is what makes this forgotten story so fascinating after all. It is not simply the discovery that medieval people divided their nights into two periods of sleep, but the realization that something once shared by millions could fade so completely from collective memory that many people now mistake its echoes for something unusual. The next time you awaken in the peaceful silence before dawn, you may find yourself wondering whether, for just a brief moment, you have stepped into a rhythm that quietly connected countless generations long before the modern world learned to keep the night awake. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is not what historians discovered, but how easily an entire civilization can forget habits that once seemed as permanent as the changing seasons. Customs repeated night after night rarely leave grand monuments behind, and because everyone accepts them as ordinary, they often survive only in casual remarks scattered through letters, court records, sermons, medical texts, and family journals. If Roger Akerch had never followed those seemingly insignificant references, how much longer would this hidden chapter of everyday life have remained invisible? His work encouraged historians to look again at countless familiar sources with fresh eyes, revealing details that previous generations had quietly overlooked. Expressions describing the first sleep and the second sleep suddenly appeared everywhere once researchers understood what they were searching for, transforming isolated phrases into pieces of a much larger historical picture. Sometimes history does not reveal itself through the discovery of new documents, but through learning to ask old documents entirely different questions. This reminds us that the lives of ordinary people often leave behind the most subtle evidence. Kings signed treaties, generals commanded armies, and rulers built magnificent cathedrals, yet the nightly routine followed by millions survived only because someone casually mentioned waking after the first sleep without believing those words would ever become important. The smallest details of daily life are often the hardest to recover precisely because they seem too familiar to deserve explanation. Sleep itself was only one part of a much broader relationship between medieval people and the natural world. Without electric light, central heating, digital clocks, or constant entertainment, nearly every aspect of life rose and fell with daylight, weather, and the changing seasons, creating routines that modern societies can only partially imagine. Their world moved more slowly, not because they lacked ambition, but because nature still determined the pace of almost everything they did. As darkness settled each evening, the village accepted the arrival of night instead of trying to conquer it. Homes became quiet, conversations softened, fires burned low, and families surrendered themselves to a rhythm that had guided their ancestors for generations, never suspecting that future centuries would replace it with an entirely different understanding of sleep. In that sense, the forgotten first and second sleep tell us as much about the modern world as they do about the Middle Ages, inviting us to ask whether progress sometimes changes not only how we live, but also how we remember what once felt perfectly natural. As the centuries continue to unfold, the forgotten pattern of segmented sleep offers more than an interesting historical curiosity. It provides a rare window into the everyday experience of people whose voices rarely dominate the pages of history. We often learn the dates of famous battles, the names of powerful kings, and the construction of magnificent castles, yet understanding how ordinary families spent the quietest hours of the night brings us closer to their world than almost any royal chronicle ever could. Perhaps history feels most alive not when we stand inside a palace, but when we sit beside the fading embers of an ordinary hearth waiting peacefully for the second sleep to return. Imagine once again that you are lying beneath thick wool blankets while the last warmth from the fireplace slowly fades into the cool air of the room. Around you, your children breathe softly. The timber beams above your head creak as they settle against the night's chill, and somewhere outside a gentle breeze brushes through the branches of an old oak standing beside the village path. Nothing dramatic happens, yet every small sound reminds you that the world continues moving even while most people remain wrapped in darkness. Beyond your home, the village rests beneath an enormous sky untouched by electric light, allowing thousands of stars to shine with a brilliance that few modern people have ever witnessed. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a pale river crossing the heavens, offering a nightly spectacle so familiar to medieval eyes that few villagers would have thought to describe it in writing. Could the beauty of such a sky have quietly shaped the way people understood both the passing of time and their own place within creation? For those awake during the peaceful interval between sleeps, the stars were more than decoration hanging above the earth. Farmers sometimes judged the changing seasons by familiar constellations. Travelers relied upon them when moving across open countryside, and many people simply paused for a quiet moment beneath the heavens before returning indoors, accepting the night as something to be experienced rather than hurried through. The darkness was never completely empty because the sky itself remained a constant companion. As your thoughts gradually become lighter, you feel the comforting heaviness of sleep drawing closer once again without the slightest effort on your part. Your breathing slows, the sounds around you seem to drift farther away, and before you fully realize it, the peaceful waking interval has quietly slipped into memory, leaving the second sleep to carry you gently toward the first light of another medieval morning. As dawn slowly approaches, the village begins preparing for another day that will look remarkably similar to the one before it. Yet no one sees that repetition as dull or meaningless. The familiar rhythm of waking, working, resting, and sleeping provides a quiet sense of stability, allowing each generation to inherit not only the land and the family home, but also an understanding of time that is deeply connected to the natural world. In many ways, the divided night is simply another thread woven into the fabric of everyday medieval life. The first person to rise is often the baker, whose work begins while much of the village still sleeps beneath the final moments of darkness. Inside the small bakehouse, the dough prepared the previous evening has rested through the night, and as the oven gradually reaches the proper temperature, the comforting aroma of fresh bread begins spreading through the cool morning air before most villagers have even opened their doors. Long before alarm clocks existed, the scent of baking bread quietly announced that a new day had begun. Not far away, the village blacksmith is already feeding charcoal into his forge, knowing that the strongest heat comes during the cool hours before the afternoon sun grows harsh. His hammer will soon echo across the settlement as he repairs horseshoes, farming tools, and broken hinges, continuing a trade that depends as much upon patience as strength. While others still enjoy the final moments of their second sleep, skilled craftsmen are already preparing for the work that will occupy the daylight hours. Farmers emerge shortly afterward, carrying wooden yokes, baskets, and simple iron tools that have served their families for years. Before walking toward the fields, many pause only briefly to share a modest breakfast of coarse bread, porridge, or leftover cheese, eating enough to sustain the long hours ahead without lingering around the table. Could they have imagined that people centuries later would study every detail of these ordinary mornings in search of clues about everyday medieval life? Children also awaken as the village comes fully to life, though their mornings rarely resemble the routines familiar today. Some help gather firewood, others fetch water from the communal well, while older boys and girls assist their parents with livestock or household chores, learning practical skills not through formal lessons, but through daily participation in family life. Education, for most children, begins not inside a classroom, but beside parents whose work quietly teaches them everything they will someday need to know. As the morning sun climbs higher, the narrow lanes fill with the familiar sounds of carts rolling over packed earth, chickens scratching near cottage doors, and neighbors exchanging news before beginning another day's work. These conversations are rarely hurried because the village moves according to the pace of daylight rather than the relentless pressure of mechanical clocks, allowing each task to unfold when the season and the weather make it most sensible. Every person understands that tomorrow will follow much the same rhythm, and there is comfort in that quiet certainty. The village well soon becomes one of the busiest gathering places, drawing women, children, and elderly residents carrying wooden buckets balanced carefully between practiced hands. While fresh water is lifted from the deep stone shaft, stories, local news, and small concerns pass naturally from one household to another, making the simple act of collecting water an important part of community life. Long before newspapers or telephones connected distant places, these daily encounters quietly held the village together. Nearby, the parish church gradually welcomes the first worshippers of the morning as sunlight filters through narrow stained glass windows onto worn stone floors polished by generations of footsteps. For many villagers, attending Mass is not simply a religious duty, but another familiar thread woven into the structure of ordinary life, just as predictable as tending crops or preparing the evening meal. Faith accompanies the rhythm of the day in much the same way that the changing light guides the rhythm of the seasons. By midday, the quiet peace of the night feels wonderfully distant as fields, workshops, kitchens, and marketplaces fill with steady activity. Yet beneath all this movement remains the memory of the restful hours that came before dawn, when families briefly awakened, reflected, prayed, spoke softly, or simply listened to the silence before returning to their second sleep. Could the calm they carried into the day have been shaped, at least in part, by those forgotten moments of stillness that modern life has almost entirely erased? As evening slowly begins its return once again, the village prepares almost instinctively for another descent into darkness. Fires are rebuilt inside the hearths. Simple suppers are shared around rough wooden tables, and one by one the windows lose their faint glow as families retire soon after sunset, unaware that centuries later historians would rediscover their nightly rhythm and reveal that one of the most ordinary parts of medieval life had become one of history's most fascinating forgotten stories. As darkness settles over the rooftops once again, every household quietly slips back into the rhythm that has guided the village for longer than anyone can remember. Supper ends with a final piece of coarse bread shared beside the hearth. The last candle is carefully extinguished to save precious tallow, and one by one the cottages surrender themselves to the silence, trusting the night to unfold exactly as it did yesterday and exactly as it will tomorrow. There is comfort in knowing that nothing extraordinary is expected before dawn, because the ordinary itself provides all the certainty anyone needs. You stretch out once more upon the familiar straw mattress, pulling the heavy wool blanket close against the evening chill, while the final glow of the embers paints faint orange reflections across the wooden beams overhead. The room slowly disappears into darkness until only the quiet breathing of your family reminds you that you are not alone. And before long the first sleep arrives with the same gentle certainty as the setting of the sun. There is no struggle to force rest, because your body has followed this rhythm since childhood, just as your parents and grandparents did before you. Outside, Gervis begins another night's patrol with the same steady footsteps that have become part of the village's hidden soundtrack. His lantern sways softly with every pace, throwing warm circles of light across the muddy lane before the darkness closes behind him once again, leaving almost no trace that anyone has passed at all. He neither rushes nor lingers because he understands that the village itself has entered the first chapter of the night, and for several peaceful hours almost every door will remain quietly closed. Beyond the cottages, the surrounding fields rest beneath a blanket of darkness broken only by the pale outline of distant hedgerows and the occasional shimmer of dew forming upon the grass. Somewhere an owl glides silently between ancient trees in search of its evening meal, while a fox pauses beside a narrow path before disappearing soundlessly into the shadows, continuing lives that unfold almost entirely unseen by the sleeping villagers. The night belongs to far more than human beings, even if those resting inside their homes rarely witness everything happening beyond their walls. Hours pass without anyone counting them, for there is little reason to measure time so precisely when the stars and the seasons provide all the guidance that daily life requires. Then, almost unnoticed, the familiar moment arrives once again as countless eyes quietly open throughout the village, not because of fear or discomfort, but because the first sleep has naturally reached its gentle conclusion. If you could wander silently from house to house at this very moment, you would discover that nearly every family has awakened together, each believing this peaceful interruption is simply another ordinary gift of the medieval night. In one cottage, an elderly widow slowly sits up beneath her blankets, pausing for a moment to listen before placing her feet upon the cool earthen floor. She reaches for a small clay cup resting beside the hearth, takes a quiet drink of water, and then folds her hands together in silent prayer, following a habit she has repeated for decades without ever questioning why the night naturally divides itself in two. To her, this peaceful interval is not an interruption but a welcome companion, offering a few moments of calm before sleep gently returns. A short distance away, a young apprentice opens his eyes as well, awakened not by noise, but by the same familiar rhythm that guides everyone around him. Tomorrow he will spend long hours learning his master's craft. Yet tonight, he simply lies awake for a while, watching the faint glow of the embers slowly pulse across the ceiling while his thoughts drift between the lessons of yesterday and the work that awaits him at sunrise. Even the youngest members of the village grow up believing this quiet pause belongs to every ordinary night, because they have never known anything different. Inside another home, a mother carefully checks the blankets covering her sleeping children before adding a single piece of wood to the fire. She moves almost silently, knowing every corner of the room by memory alone, and after making certain the warmth will last until morning, she quietly returns to bed beside her husband without exchanging a single unnecessary word. How many thousands of families carried out these same gentle routines across medieval Europe while leaving almost no trace of them in the historical record? Outside, Gervas pauses beside the village well, allowing the silence to settle around him before continuing his patrol. The surface of the water reflects a handful of distant stars between passing clouds, and for a brief moment the entire village seems suspended between earth and sky, as though time itself has slowed during these hidden hours that belong neither fully to yesterday nor completely to tomorrow. Standing there alone, he understands why so many people treasure this quiet part of the night without ever feeling the need to explain it. Eventually, the familiar heaviness of sleep begins returning to every household almost as gently as it departed. One by one, whispered conversations fade, prayers come to their natural conclusion, the last glowing embers settle deeper into the ashes, and throughout the village families once again surrender themselves to the comforting embrace of the second sleep. Without clocks, alarms, or anxious thoughts, the medieval night quietly completes another cycle, preserving a rhythm that will continue unchanged for generations before slowly disappearing into history. Morning eventually spreads across the countryside with quiet determination, washing away the last traces of the night that only hours before had belonged to whispered prayers, gentle conversations, and the peaceful interval between two sleeps. Smoke begins curling from cottage chimneys, stable doors creak open one after another, and the village gradually exchanges the silence of darkness for the familiar sounds of another working day, without anyone giving a second thought to the unusual rhythm that carried them there. For the people living here, the divided night is no stranger than the changing of the seasons, because it has always been part of life. As the sun climbs above the fields, merchants prepare small stalls near the village square, while craftsmen open the heavy wooden doors of their workshops. The cooper examines barrels drying outside his shed, the carpenter sharpens well-worn tools before beginning another day's labor, and the weaver settles before the loom with movements so practiced that they require almost no conscious thought. Every trade depends upon daylight, making the hours after sunrise far too valuable to waste after a night that has already provided both rest and quiet reflection. Children hurry through the narrow lanes carrying small bundles of kindling or buckets filled from the village well, laughing as they chase one another between cottages before being called back to their chores. Older boys accompany their fathers toward the fields, while young girls help prepare bread, tend gardens, or care for younger siblings, learning responsibilities little by little through daily experience rather than formal instruction. Their education is woven into ordinary life, passing naturally from one generation to the next just as the rhythm of the night quietly passes with it. For travelers arriving from distant towns, the village appears almost unchanged from countless others scattered across the countryside. They notice the timber-framed homes, the small church standing above the clustered rooftops, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the morning air, and the steady movement of people already busy with their work. Yet they rarely realize that every family has already lived through two separate periods of sleep before the day even began. Some of history's most fascinating traditions remain invisible precisely because they are shared by everyone. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to imagine medieval life only through dramatic events, towering castles, or famous rulers whose names fill history books. Yet the forgotten custom of the first and second sleep reminds us that ordinary moments often reveal far more about how people truly lived than the greatest battles or the grandest ceremonies ever could. Sometimes the quietest hours of the night preserve the deepest truths about the human experience, waiting patiently for someone to notice them again. As evening falls once more, the village slowly releases the demands of the day and returns to the quiet rhythm that has shaped every generation before it. The blacksmith lets the final glow fade from his forge, the baker sweeps flour from his worn wooden table, and the farmers return from the fields with tired shoulders, knowing that darkness now belongs to rest rather than labor. Without anyone announcing it, The entire community prepares for another journey through a night divided into two peaceful chapters. Inside your home, the evening meal is simple but satisfying, shared around the warmth of the hearth while the fading fire casts gentle shadows across the timber walls. Conversation lingers only briefly because everyone understands that tomorrow will begin early, and before long the children curl beneath their blankets while the adults quietly finish the last small tasks before extinguishing the light. There is no temptation to remain awake for hours because the setting sun has already told the body everything it needs to know. Outside, the final traces of daylight disappear beyond the rolling countryside until the sky becomes a vast canopy filled with stars stretching from one horizon to the other. Without smoke from great cities or the glow of electric lights, every constellation shines with astonishing clarity, becoming as familiar to the villagers as the roads leading between their homes. Could generations who lived beneath such brilliant skies have experienced the passing of night in a way that is almost impossible for us to imagine today? As the first sleep settles across the village, silence gradually replaces every remaining sound of daylight. Doors are barred, livestock grows quiet inside their shelters, and only the occasional crackle from a dying fire escapes through a chimney before dissolving into the cool night air. The darkness is not empty but patiently waiting, holding within it the familiar interval that everyone expects yet almost no one ever speaks about. Several hours later, almost as though guided by an invisible hand, you slowly awaken once again without surprise or confusion. The room remains wrapped in darkness, yet your thoughts feel unusually clear and unhurried, free from the worries that accompany daylight, while somewhere outside the distant footsteps of Gervis echo softly against the packed earth as he continues another peaceful patrol through the sleeping village. In this forgotten moment between the first and second sleep, the medieval night reveals itself not as a place of interruption, but as a quiet companion that generations accepted with complete trust. You remain awake for a little while longer, not because sleep has abandoned you, but because this quiet interval seems to possess a character all its own. The silence is gentle rather than unsettling, allowing every small sound to stand out with remarkable clarity as the embers breathe softly within the hearth and the wind brushes against the timber walls. In these peaceful moments, the night feels less like an empty absence of daylight and more like a living part of the world with its own quiet purpose. Across the village, similar scenes unfold behind dozens of wooden doors without anyone realizing they are participating in a pattern that future generations will almost completely forget. An elderly couple whispers about the coming harvest, a young father checks the latch on the stable before returning indoors, and a widow quietly watches the fading fire while reflecting on years that seem to pass as steadily as the seasons themselves. Every household fills these moments differently, yet all are united by the same calm understanding that the second sleep will return in its own time. The watchman reaches the small crossroads near the center of the village, where four narrow lanes disappear into darkness between cottages built by generations of careful hands. He pauses only long enough to listen, his lantern casting a warm glow across the worn stones beneath his boots, while the rest of the village remains wrapped in silence, so complete that even the smallest sound carries surprising distance. Experience has taught him that a peaceful night is not measured by perfect stillness, but by familiar sounds remaining exactly where they belong. Far above, the clouds slowly drift apart, revealing countless stars that brighten the sky with extraordinary clarity. Without smoke from factories or the glow of distant cities, the heavens appear almost impossibly vast, reminding anyone awake that the world extends far beyond the quiet boundaries of the village resting below. Could nights like these have inspired people to feel a deeper connection with the passing seasons simply because they spent so much more time beneath the open sky? As your thoughts gradually grow heavier, the brief waking interval begins drawing quietly toward its end without any effort on your part. Your breathing becomes slower, the comforting weight of the blanket settles around you once again, and before you have fully noticed the change, the second sleep gently carries you back into peaceful dreams while the medieval village continues resting beneath the endless stars, following a rhythm that would endure for centuries before slowly fading from human memory. As the village sleeps through the final hours before dawn, nothing seems extraordinary to the people resting inside their modest homes. They do not realize that the quiet rhythm guiding their nights has endured for centuries, passed naturally from parents to children without written rules or formal instruction, becoming so familiar that almost no one thinks to describe it in detail. The most enduring traditions are often the easiest to overlook because they become woven into everyday life until they feel as permanent as the sunrise itself. Centuries later, historians searching through forgotten archives would uncover scattered references that at first appeared insignificant. A witness describing an event after the first sleep, a physician advising patients about the hours between two periods of rest, and a writer casually mentioning the second sleep all seemed unrelated until they were viewed together, revealing fragments of a forgotten pattern hidden across hundreds of documents. Could so many independent voices have been describing the same nightly experience without realizing they were preserving an extraordinary piece of history? The discovery reminds us that history is often reconstructed from the smallest surviving details rather than dramatic revelations. Great monuments may tell us how rulers wished to be remembered, but ordinary habits survive only through the casual words of people who never imagined anyone would study their daily routines hundreds of years later. In many ways, the forgotten rhythm of medieval sleep survived not because someone tried to preserve it, but because no one believed it could ever disappear. Modern science has added another fascinating layer to this story by exploring how the human body responds when artificial light is removed from daily life. Volunteers living for extended periods under natural daylight often begin following patterns surprisingly similar to those described in historical records, awakening peacefully after several hours before drifting naturally into a second period of sleep without forcing the process. Rather than proving medieval people were unusual, these experiments suggest that modern lifestyles may have gradually encouraged us to forget a rhythm our bodies once followed with remarkable ease. Perhaps that is why this forgotten custom continues to fascinate so many people today. It gently challenges one of our strongest assumptions about sleep while reminding us that what feels completely normal in one century may seem mysterious in another, encouraging us to look at both history and ourselves with greater curiosity. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not about uncovering something entirely new, but about remembering something humanity quietly knew all along before the modern world allowed it to slip into the darkness of forgotten nights. Although the medieval pattern of first and second sleep eventually faded from everyday life, its rediscovery has changed the way many historians interpret countless ordinary documents from the past. References that once seemed confusing now make perfect sense, revealing that writers were not describing unusual interruptions, but a nightly rhythm so familiar that they expected every reader to understand it without further explanation. It is a powerful reminder that history often hides its greatest revelations inside the simplest sentences. The next time you find yourself awake in the quiet hours before dawn, you may remember that millions of people once experienced exactly the same peaceful interval without fear or frustration. They did not immediately assume that something had gone wrong, nor did they measure the passing minutes with anxious glances toward a glowing clock, because they trusted the night to complete its own natural cycle in its own unhurried time. Could a small change in the way we understand these moments transform the way we experience them? Of course, the modern world is very different from the medieval one, and few people today can arrange their lives around sunsets, church bells, or the changing seasons. Work schedules, artificial lighting, technology, and countless daily responsibilities shape our nights in ways that our ancestors could never have imagined, making it impossible to recreate their routine exactly even if we wish to do so. Yet understanding their world allows us to appreciate just how deeply the environment influences something as personal as sleep. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within this forgotten chapter of history. Human habits often feel permanent while we are living them. Yet even practices shared by entire civilizations can slowly disappear until only scattered clues remain behind, waiting for patient researchers to recognize their meaning centuries later. The story of medieval sleep reminds us that the past is filled with ordinary experiences that seem astonishing only because time has taught us to forget them. So as the village disappears once more into the darkness, the watchman continues his quiet rounds, The last embers glow softly beneath layers of ash, and families drift peacefully from the first sleep into the second, without ever imagining that future generations would marvel at what they considered perfectly ordinary. Above them, the stars continue their silent journey across the night sky exactly as they have for thousands of years, watching over a rhythm that once united countless lives before gradually fading beneath the lights of the modern age. And perhaps, somewhere deep within us, that ancient rhythm still lingers, patiently waiting to remind us that history is not only found in castles and kingdoms, but also in the quiet moments of an ordinary night when the world falls silent and humanity simply rests. The rediscovery of this forgotten sleeping pattern has also encouraged people to ask a broader question about the past. How many other ordinary customs have quietly disappeared without leaving obvious traces, simply because they were so common that no one thought they needed to be recorded? History is often imagined as a collection of extraordinary events, yet the habits that shape everyday life are sometimes the first to vanish from memory. When archaeologists uncover a broken cooking pot or historians read an old diary, they are not simply collecting objects or words. They are patiently rebuilding entire worlds from fragments, trying to understand how people ate, worked, spoke, rested, and dreamed, knowing that these quiet details often reveal far more about a civilization than the victories of kings or the borders of kingdoms. Every forgotten routine recovered from the past brings us one step closer to seeing medieval life as its people actually experienced it. That is why the story of the first and second sleep feels so remarkably human. It does not depend upon famous rulers, spectacular battles, or legendary heroes, but upon ordinary families settling beneath rough blankets at the end of another long day, trusting the darkness to guide them through a rhythm that seemed as natural as breathing itself. Could there be any better reminder that the greatest mysteries of history are sometimes hidden within the simplest moments of everyday existence? Imagine walking once more through that quiet village after midnight, long after every candle has been extinguished and only the stars remain to illuminate the narrow lanes. The air is cool, the scent of wood smoke still lingers above the rooftops, and somewhere in the distance the slow footsteps of the watchmen continue their familiar journey, while nearly every household rests peacefully between two periods of sleep. Nothing appears dramatic, yet every cottage quietly preserves a way of living that future centuries will almost completely forget. As you pause beside the old stone church, the entire settlement seems suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. No sound of machinery reaches your ears, no bright lights compete with the heavens above, and the silence feels so complete that even the faint rustle of leaves becomes part of the night's gentle rhythm, inviting you to understand the Middle Ages not through moments of conflict, but through moments of remarkable stillness. In that silence, the forgotten heartbeat of medieval life becomes easier to hear than ever before. As you leave the church behind and continue walking through the sleeping village, you begin to notice how every building seems to belong naturally to the landscape around it. Timber-framed cottages lean gently with age, thatched roofs glisten beneath a thin layer of dew, and narrow footpaths connect one home to another with the quiet familiarity of routes worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Nothing has been arranged for beauty alone, yet the entire village possesses a harmony that comes from centuries of people building only what they truly needed. At the edge of the settlement, the fields stretch into darkness, divided by low hedgerows and rough wooden fences that disappear beyond the reach of the watchman's lantern. During daylight, these meadows provide grain, vegetables, and grazing land that sustain every family through the changing seasons. But tonight they rest beneath a blanket of mist so still that they seem almost untouched by time. The countryside itself appears to be sleeping alongside the people who depend upon it. Not far away, a small stream winds quietly through the valley, its gentle current reflecting scattered fragments of starlight whenever the clouds briefly part overhead. Water has shaped this village for generations, supplying homes, livestock, gardens, and nearby mills. Yet during the deepest hours of the night, its steady murmur becomes one of the few sounds capable of breaking the remarkable silence. Could the constant presence of nature have made the darkness feel less lonely than it often does in the modern world? Beyond the stream stands the village mill, silent now after turning tirelessly throughout the daylight hours. The great wooden wheel no longer creaks against the flowing water. Sacks of grain rest neatly beneath the sheltering roof, and even the miller's faithful horse sleeps peacefully inside the nearby stable, waiting for another dawn to begin the familiar work all over again. Every corner of the village seems to understand that the night is a time for patience rather than activity. Slowly, your attention returns once more to the sky above, where countless stars continue their silent journey across the heavens exactly as they did for the people living here centuries ago. They watched these same constellations while moving between their first and second sleep, never imagining that one day their ordinary nights would become the subject of books, documentaries, and historical research seeking to recover a forgotten rhythm. In that realization lies perhaps the greatest wonder of all. The simplest moments of everyday life often become the hardest for history to remember, yet once rediscovered, they reveal the humanity of the past more clearly than any castle, battlefield, or royal crown ever could. The more carefully historians examined medieval records, the clearer it became that this forgotten rhythm reached far beyond a single country or a single generation. References to the first sleep appeared in England, France, Italy, Germany, and other parts of Europe, while similar descriptions surfaced in medical writings, religious texts, private correspondence, and literary works, each reinforcing the same quiet pattern without treating it as anything unusual. The remarkable consistency of these accounts suggests that this was not an isolated custom, but one of the shared experiences that quietly united millions of ordinary lives. What makes these discoveries especially convincing is the way they appear almost by accident within the historical record. A witness describing when a conversation took place, a physician recommending the best time for certain activities, or a monk recording his nightly routine never paused to explain what the first sleep meant because they assumed every reader already understood the expression. Could there be stronger evidence that a practice had become completely woven into everyday life than the simple fact that nobody felt the need to define it? This quiet confidence stands in striking contrast to the modern world, where waking after midnight often causes immediate concern. Today, many people instinctively reach for a phone, check the time, or begin calculating how many hours of sleep remain before morning, allowing anxiety to replace the calm acceptance that once characterized these same moments. The experience itself may not have changed nearly as much as the meaning we attach to it. Even so, the medieval night was never presented as a romantic escape from hardship. Homes remained cold through much of the winter. Work demanded enormous physical effort. Illness was common, and daily survival depended upon successful harvests and strong communities, reminding us that this forgotten rhythm existed within a world filled with challenges very different from our own. Understanding the past does not require imagining it as perfect, only seeing it as the people living there understood it. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate so deeply today. It reminds us that beneath changing technologies, shifting cultures, and centuries of progress, human beings have always searched for comfort, routine, and meaning in the quiet hours between sunset and sunrise, leaving behind small traces that patiently waited for history to notice them once again. And as you think back to that peaceful medieval village disappearing into the darkness beneath a sky overflowing with stars, it becomes easier to understand that sometimes the greatest discoveries are not about learning something entirely new, but about remembering something humanity quietly forgot. As researchers continued comparing evidence from different centuries, they began to realize that the disappearance of segmented sleep had not happened because people suddenly decided to change their habits. Instead, it unfolded gradually as every generation adapted to a world becoming brighter, busier, and increasingly governed by precise schedules rather than the rising and setting of the sun. The transformation was so slow that few people ever noticed they were leaving behind a rhythm their ancestors had followed for hundreds of years. The invention of brighter and more affordable lighting extended the evening in ways that would have seemed extraordinary to a medieval villager. Families remained awake longer. Shops stayed open after sunset. Public spaces became active well into the night. And eventually the body received fewer natural signals telling it that darkness had arrived and rest should begin. Could something as simple as turning night into day have quietly reshaped one of humanity's oldest biological habits? Industrial cities accelerated this change even further by demanding punctuality above flexibility. Factory whistles, railway timetables, and standardized working hours encouraged millions of people to compress their sleep into a single uninterrupted period, not because human biology had suddenly evolved, but because society increasingly required everyone to follow the same carefully measured routine. Gradually, what had once been considered completely ordinary began to seem unusual simply because fewer people experienced it. This shift also changed the language people used to describe their nights. Expressions like first sleep and second sleep, once understood without explanation, slowly disappeared from everyday conversation until later generations encountered them only in old manuscripts whose meaning had become difficult to recognize. When the words vanished, the custom quietly vanished with them, leaving behind only scattered clues preserved inside forgotten pages. Looking back now, it is remarkable to think that one of the most widespread human experiences could almost disappear from memory without any dramatic event marking its end. There was no single law banning segmented sleep, no great debate announcing its disappearance, and no generation that consciously decided to abandon it forever. Only countless small changes that gradually transformed the relationship between people, darkness, and time itself. Sometimes history changes not through sudden revolutions, but through quiet habits that slowly fade until one day almost no one remembers they ever existed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, uninterrupted sleep had become the new ideal across much of the industrialized world. Medical advice, school schedules, factory work, and the growing presence of artificial light all reinforced the belief that a good night's sleep should consist of one continuous stretch, gradually replacing a rhythm that had once felt completely natural. Few people realized they were embracing a modern expectation rather than preserving an ancient tradition. This change shaped not only the way people slept, but also the way they judged themselves when sleep did not unfold as expected. Waking quietly in the middle of the night, once accepted without concern, increasingly became a source of frustration as countless individuals lay awake wondering why they could not remain asleep until morning. How many nights have been filled with unnecessary worry simply because an old pattern was forgotten rather than understood? Researchers studying sleep today often point out that the human brain remains remarkably responsive to light. Exposure to bright artificial illumination during the evening delays the natural release of hormones that prepare the body for rest, while screens, streetlights, and busy nighttime routines extend wakefulness far beyond what previous generations experienced beneath candlelight and stars. The environment surrounding sleep has changed more dramatically in the past 2 centuries than during many thousands of years before them. That realization encourages a different way of looking at the medieval night. Instead of imagining it as strange or primitive, we begin to recognize it as a world shaped by natural darkness, where the human body followed signals that modern life frequently masks beneath constant illumination. The people living in that world were not consciously practicing an unusual method of sleeping. They were simply responding to conditions that had governed humanity for countless generations. Perhaps the greatest value of rediscovering the first and second sleep is not that it tells us how we should live today, but that it reminds us how easily our understanding of what is normal can change over time. Customs that seem permanent often prove surprisingly fragile, and habits shared by millions may disappear so quietly that only centuries later do we realize they were ever there at all. By recovering these forgotten nights, we recover something equally important: a deeper appreciation for the ordinary lives that shaped history long before history remembered to write them down. As we step away from that medieval village for the final time, it becomes clear that the story of the first and second sleep is not simply about the past. It is a reminder that the routines shaping our daily lives are often so familiar that we never stop to question them, believing they have always existed exactly as we know them today. History quietly teaches us that even the most ordinary habits can change, disappear, and eventually become mysteries waiting to be rediscovered. For centuries, families ended their days beneath skies untouched by electric light. trusting darkness to guide them through two gentle periods of rest separated by a peaceful interval of wakefulness. They never imagined they were preserving a unique tradition because, to them, there was nothing remarkable about waking after the first sleep, whispering a prayer, tending the fire, sharing a quiet conversation, or simply sitting with their thoughts before returning to bed. Those moments were as ordinary as sunrise, woven so deeply into everyday life that they required no explanation. Only when that rhythm slowly vanished did its absence become visible. The words that once appeared naturally in letters, court records, poems, and medical writings gradually disappeared from everyday language, taking their meaning with them until future generations could no longer recognize what earlier centuries had accepted without question. A habit followed by millions faded so completely that historians themselves overlooked it for generations before patient research finally revealed the forgotten pattern hidden within familiar documents. Perhaps that is the greatest gift offered by this forgotten chapter of history. It encourages us to look beyond the grand events recorded in chronicles and instead appreciate the quiet experiences that truly filled the lives of ordinary people, reminding us that history is not built only from kings, wars, and monuments, but also from evenings beside a fading fire, whispered conversations beneath wool blankets, footsteps echoing softly through sleeping villages, and peaceful moments spent awake beneath a sky overflowing with stars. Sometimes the smallest moments survive the longest, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear their story once again. So the next time you find yourself awake during the stillness before dawn, when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow and silence settles gently around you, perhaps you will remember those countless medieval families who experienced the very same quiet interval without fear, without clocks, and without believing anything unusual had happened at all. In that peaceful moment, separated by centuries yet connected by the same human experience, you may discover that the forgotten rhythm of the first and second sleep has never completely disappeared. It has simply been waiting, hidden beneath the noise of the modern world, for history to remind us that it was there all along. Even after all the evidence gathered by historians, one quiet truth remains almost impossible to ignore. The medieval villagers whose lives have accompanied us through this journey never realized they were living in a way that future generations would consider extraordinary, because to them these nights were simply life itself, repeated with such consistency that they seemed destined to last forever. How many of our own daily routines might one day appear just as mysterious to people living hundreds of years from now? History has a remarkable habit of preserving the spectacular while allowing the ordinary to disappear. Castles continue to dominate the landscape, cathedrals still rise above ancient towns, and the names of kings remain carved into stone. Yet the peaceful habit of waking between two sleeps nearly vanished because it lived not in monuments, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary families whose greatest concern was preparing for another day. Their nightly routine left almost no physical trace, surviving only through scattered words written without the slightest intention of explaining themselves. That is precisely what makes those forgotten documents so valuable today. A casual sentence in a diary, a passing remark in a courtroom, a physician's simple recommendation, or a line tucked inside a medieval poem suddenly becomes far more meaningful once we understand the world in which those words were written. The documents themselves never changed, but our ability to read them changed completely once the hidden rhythm behind their language was finally recognized. The rediscovery of segmented sleep also reminds us that the past often appears stranger than it truly was simply because we view it through modern expectations. Medieval people did not consider themselves unusual for sleeping in two stages any more than we consider ourselves unusual for using electric lights after sunset, because every generation accepts its own habits as the natural way human life is supposed to unfold. Only when centuries pass do those assumptions begin to dissolve, revealing how deeply culture and environment quietly shape even the most personal experiences. As our journey through the medieval night comes gently to an end, imagine standing one final time at the edge of that sleeping village while the first light of dawn slowly touches the eastern horizon. Behind you, families remain peacefully wrapped beneath wool blankets after completing another night divided into two quiet periods of rest. while ahead of you another ordinary day prepares to begin exactly as countless others have before it. They will never know that centuries later people across the world will wonder about the forgotten rhythm that guided their nights. But perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this story, because the greatest chapters of human history are often written not by extraordinary moments, but by the quiet routines that everyone believed would last forever. The sun now rises fully above the distant fields, bathing the village in a warm golden light that gradually erases the mystery of the night. Doors open wide, smoke climbs from every chimney, and voices once softened to whispers now carry freely through the narrow lanes, while the peaceful interval between the first and second sleep already begins slipping quietly into memory, just as it has every morning for countless generations. No one pauses to speak about it because there is nothing unusual to remember. It was simply another ordinary night. As the hours pass, the rhythm of work fills every corner of the settlement with familiar purpose. Women knead fresh dough, shepherds guide their flocks toward open pasture, carpenters shape rough timber beneath the steady rhythm of their tools, and children race between cottages carrying out small tasks with the boundless energy that only youth can bring. Each person contributing to a community whose survival depends upon shared effort rather than individual comfort. The peaceful hours before dawn now seem distant, yet they quietly prepared everyone for the labor that daylight demands. If you asked any villager how they slept the previous night, they would likely answer with puzzled simplicity. They might mention waking for a short while before returning to bed, but they would never describe the experience as remarkable because, in their minds, there is no other sensible way for a human being to spend a long winter night. Could they ever have imagined that people centuries in the future would lie awake in the same darkness, wondering whether something had gone wrong instead of recognizing a rhythm that once united entire civilizations? This contrast between past and present invites us to reconsider how easily expectations shape human experience. When society teaches us that uninterrupted sleep is the only healthy pattern, even a peaceful awakening can become a source of worry. Yet the medieval world demonstrates that the very same experience was once accepted with complete confidence and without fear. The body may whisper the same ancient signals it always has, while the meaning we attach to those signals changes from one age to another. So as our journey finally draws to its quiet conclusion, leave that medieval village exactly as you found it, resting beneath an immense sky where darkness is neither feared nor conquered, but simply welcomed as another part of life. The watchman's lantern fades into the distance. The church bell waits patiently for another hour, and families continue drifting peacefully between their first and second sleep, completely unaware that one day their ordinary nights would help the modern world rediscover a forgotten chapter of human history. And perhaps, the next time silence wakes you before dawn, you will remember not a mystery, but an echo of countless nights lived by ordinary people whose forgotten rhythm still lingers, quietly reminding us that the past is often much closer than we ever imagine. As you walk away from the village for the very last time, it becomes easier to understand why this forgotten custom disappeared so completely from human memory. Nothing about it seemed important enough to record because it belonged to everyone equally, crossing the boundaries between rich and poor, farmer and merchant, child and elder, until it became almost invisible through its own familiarity. The most universal parts of daily life are often the ones history struggles hardest to preserve. Generations were born into this rhythm, lived their entire lives within it, and passed it quietly to their children without ever imagining it needed to be explained. There were no lessons teaching the first sleep or the second sleep because the night itself became the teacher, guiding every household through a pattern repeated so faithfully that it felt as permanent as the changing of the seasons. Could any of them have believed that one day humanity would forget something so deeply woven into ordinary existence? When artificial light gradually pushed darkness farther into the evening, the transformation happened so slowly that few people noticed the ancient rhythm beginning to fade. One generation stayed awake a little longer than the last. Children grew accustomed to brighter evenings than their grandparents had known, and eventually the peaceful waking interval that once belonged to nearly every household quietly disappeared beneath new expectations about work, productivity, and time. No great event marked its passing because history rarely announces the disappearance of ordinary habits. Even today, however, echoes of that older world still seem to linger beneath the surface of modern life. Many people occasionally wake during the quietest hours before dawn, finding themselves suspended between sleep and wakefulness in a strangely peaceful state that feels different from ordinary consciousness, as though the mind briefly remembers a rhythm the calendar has forgotten. Whether we recognize it or not, those silent moments continue to connect us with countless generations who experienced the very same stillness beneath skies illuminated only by stars. Perhaps that is why the story of medieval sleep has captured the imagination of so many readers and historians alike. It reminds us that history is not only a record of what humanity achieved, but also a memory of how humanity lived, rested, dreamed, and quietly passed through the unnoticed hours between one day and the next. Long after the names of rulers have faded and the echoes of battles have fallen silent, the forgotten rhythm of the first and second sleep still whispers one simple truth: that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, often leave behind the most extraordinary stories of all. The quiet story of the first and second sleep also reminds us that the past is rarely as distant as it first appears. Across the centuries, human beings have continued to seek warmth, safety, companionship, and peaceful rest at the end of each day, even though the world surrounding those simple needs has changed beyond recognition. The tools may be different, the houses may be brighter, and the nights may be shorter, but the desire to find comfort before sleep remains one of the few experiences shared by every generation. Perhaps that is why medieval life continues to fascinate us so deeply. It allows us to recognize ourselves in people who lived hundreds of years ago, not because their world was identical to ours, but because their hopes, routines, and quiet moments were shaped by the same human nature that still exists today. Could the greatest bridge between the past and the present be found not in great historical events, but in the ordinary experiences every person understands without needing them explained? As darkness returned each evening, no villager believed they were preserving a tradition for future historians. They simply closed their shutters against the cold, shared a final conversation beside the fire, climbed beneath heavy blankets, and surrendered themselves to the first sleep with complete confidence that the night would unfold exactly as it always had. Their certainty came not from scientific theories or carefully measured schedules, but from generations of experience quietly confirming that this rhythm belonged to the natural order of life. When the peaceful waking interval arrived, it was greeted with patience instead of resistance. Some remained lying quietly with their thoughts. Others whispered gentle prayers, checked the fire, or exchanged a few quiet words with loved ones before allowing sleep to return on its own, never imagining that one day people would search books and archives trying to understand why they had awakened in the middle of the night. The answers they unknowingly preserved would remain hidden for centuries inside ordinary sentences that seemed too simple to matter. As researchers continue uncovering forgotten pieces of everyday history, stories like this remind us that the greatest discoveries are often waiting in places that generations of readers have overlooked. A single phrase copied into a diary, a passing remark in a legal document, or a brief observation inside a medical text can suddenly illuminate an entire way of life once someone recognizes its true meaning. History rarely speaks through loud declarations. More often, it whispers patiently through the smallest details until someone finally learns how to listen. Each forgotten custom that historians recover adds another small piece to a picture that can never be completed through monuments alone. Castles reveal how the powerful wish to be seen. Churches preserve the faith that guided communities, and city walls speak of danger and defense. Yet the quiet routines inside ordinary homes often tell us far more about what life actually felt like from one day to the next. It is within these unnoticed moments that the true heartbeat of the Middle Ages continues to survive. The story of the first and second sleep is one of those rare discoveries that changes our understanding without changing the historical evidence itself. The manuscripts, court records, poems, medical treatises, and private letters had always existed, patiently waiting on library shelves and in forgotten archives. But their meaning remained incomplete until someone recognized the forgotten pattern connecting them all. how many other pieces of history still lie hidden in plain sight, waiting for a fresh question to reveal what generations of readers never noticed? As we reflect on this forgotten rhythm one final time, imagine the village settling once again beneath the stars exactly as it has throughout our journey. The watchman continues his silent patrol. The last embers glow beneath a blanket of ash. Families drift peacefully through their first sleep before waking for a quiet hour of reflection, and then surrender once more to the second sleep as dawn slowly approaches, never realizing that centuries later their ordinary nights would help us rediscover something profoundly human. Perhaps that is the greatest gift history can offer, not simply knowledge of the past, but the quiet realization that beneath changing centuries, changing technologies, and changing expectations, the ordinary experiences shared by countless lives remain capable of connecting us across time in ways no monument ever could. As evening settles over the countryside once again, the cycle begins exactly where it always has, without ceremony and without anyone stopping to think about the quiet order shaping their lives. The last tools are returned to their places, animals are secured for the night, the fire is carefully tended, and families gather around its fading warmth before darkness gently invites them toward another first sleep. For every person in the village, this rhythm feels as dependable as the turning of the seasons, requiring neither explanation nor instruction. The older villagers sometimes remember winters from many decades earlier, when the snow lay so deep that the nights seemed endless and darkness lingered for nearly half the day. Even then, they recall no anxiety about waking after several hours of rest, because the peaceful interval between sleeps was simply another familiar companion during those long cold months, offering quiet moments beside the hearth before sleep returned once more. Their memories are filled not with concern, but with the comforting certainty that the night always unfolded as it should. You can almost hear one of those elders speaking softly to a grandchild resting beneath the same blanket, explaining how the silence after the first sleep is nothing to fear. The child listens while staring toward the dying embers, accepting those words without question because every adult they have ever known follows exactly the same pattern, making it seem impossible that life could be any different. Could traditions become strongest precisely because they are learned without formal teaching, simply by watching the people we trust most? Across the village, the church bell quietly marks another passing hour, though few people feel any need to count the time. The sound drifts across fields, gardens, and rooftops before dissolving into the cool night air, reminding anyone still awake that the hours continue their patient journey whether they are measured or not. In a world without glowing clocks beside every bed, time is experienced rather than constantly observed. Long after the bell has fallen silent, the village settles once again into complete stillness as the second sleep gently embraces every household. Tomorrow the same rhythm will repeat, just as it did yesterday and countless days before, carrying ordinary people through ordinary lives that history almost allowed itself to forget. And perhaps that quiet repetition is exactly what makes this forgotten custom so extraordinary today, because it reminds us that the greatest stories are often hidden inside the routines that once seemed too ordinary to ever be remembered. Another night passes almost unnoticed, blending into the countless evenings that came before it, each one following the same quiet pattern that no villager believes will ever change. The first sleep arrives soon after darkness. The peaceful waking interval gently unfolds without fear or confusion, and the second sleep carries the village toward another dawn with a reassuring sense of order that has guided generations. Nothing about this sequence feels remarkable, because it is simply the way life has always been lived. If someone from the modern world could quietly observe these nights without revealing themselves, they might be surprised by how calm every awakening appears. No one rushes to count the remaining hours until morning, no one worries that something has gone wrong, and no one struggles anxiously against wakefulness, because the silence itself reassures them that this gentle pause belongs exactly where it is. Perhaps peace comes more easily when expectations agree with the natural rhythm of the body instead of resisting it. As the centuries slowly carried humanity toward brighter evenings and busier lives, the memory of these nights faded almost without anyone noticing. Yet hidden inside old manuscripts, forgotten journals, and ordinary conversations preserved on fragile pages. The first and second sleep patiently waited to be recognized once again, reminding us that history does not only preserve what people considered important, but sometimes also what they believed was far too ordinary to ever be forgotten. And in rediscovering those quiet medieval nights, we rediscover something equally valuable: the understanding that even the smallest routines of everyday life can become extraordinary when viewed through the long passage of time.